Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Casey Hansen, and I will be the forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science, and we want to thank Professor Steve Johnston for his leadership in organizing this year's Neal A. Maxwell Lecture in Political Theory and Contemporary Politics. Today's forum is titled More Beautiful Than Democracy, Toni Morrison and the Possibility of a Shareable World. And we are excited to be joined by an incredible speaker and two distinguished commentators. I'll now turn it over to Professor Johnston to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Casey. As Casey mentioned, my name is Steve Johnston, and I have the pleasure of holding the Neal Maxwell Chair here in the Department of Political Science. And I want to thank the founders and funders of the Maxwell Chair for making this forum possible today. It's through their generosity that we're able to put on events like this on a regular basis. And I also want to thank our Hinckley hosts for such a great site and making all the arrangements. So thanks to you, Nick, for doing this, and thanks to you too, Casey. I'll introduce our speakers today. Jasmine Syedullah is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Vassar College. She is co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, published by North Atlantic Books in 2016. Her journal articles include Becoming More Ourselves, 4 Emergent Strategies of Black Feminist Congregational Abolition, published in Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International. Take a moment to ask yourself if this is how we fall apart. Practices for mutually reinforced resilience in the time of reckoning, more lessons from the Manual for Liberating Survival, published in Journal of Women, Politics, and Policy. Care and the Commons, published in Contemporary Political Theory. And she's also the author of the book chapters Beyond the Battlefield of Institutions, Everyday Abolition from the Antebellum South, in the book Let Spirit Speak, Cultural Journeys Through the African Diaspora, and The Unbearable Will to Whiteness, in Buddhism in Whiteness, Critical Reflections, and finally, an Embodied Dharma of Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Oxford Handbook of Buddhist Practice. Paul Taylor is the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt University. He is the author of the following books: Race, A Philosophical Introduction, published by Polity in 2004, On Obama, published by Routledge in 2015, and Black is Beautiful, A Philosophy of Black Aesthetics, published by Blackwell in 2016, which was awarded the 2017 American Society for Aesthetics Monograph Prize. And he's currently working on 2 books, Facing Ferguson for the University of Chicago Press, and Uneasy Sanctuary, Rethinking Race Thinking for Oxford University Press. He is also the author of roughly 4 dozen journal articles and book chapters. Lawrie Balfour is James Hart Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. She is the author of The Evidence of Things Not Said, James Baldwin and the Promise of American Democracy, published by Cornell University Press in 2001. Democracy's Reconstruction, Thinking Politically with W.E.B. Du Bois, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And the forthcoming Imagining Freedom, Toni Morrison and the Work of Words, and that is forthcoming from Oxford University Press next year. She's the author of 18 journal articles and book chapters appearing in such outlets as Political Theory, American Political Science Review, The Review of Politics, Perspectives on Politics, and Hypatia. And she's also the former editor of Political Theory, which is the flagship journal in the subfield. So please join me in welcoming all of our guests here today. And we'll begin with Professor Balfour.
Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to begin by thanking Steve Johnston for the invitation now several years ago. and for the extraordinary patience and kind of heroic efforts that it took to organize this talk, then to reorganize it, and then to reorganize it again as the pandemic required multiple reschedulings. I also want to extend my thanks to Jasmine, Syedullah, and Paul Taylor, whose work has shaped and inspired my thinking. I got the chance to invite a dream team, and so I'm thrilled. This paper is a first attempt to think through some of the questions that arose but never got answered when I was finishing a book on Toni Morrison and the imagination of freedom. And I should say, don't be deceived. There is a slide. There will be two more, just so that when I talk about long passages, you're not left without some text to follow. And I wanted to include this slide because the epigraph to the paper does not appear in the body of the paper, and I think it's helpful for framing my comments. Democracy is in danger. The signs are everywhere. The popularity of authoritarian leaders around the world has enabled them to strip citizens of their rights and the earth of its wealth with shocking impunity. In the US, old handbooks of self-governance are being discarded or rewritten on the fly. The legitimacy of elections is now disputed before anyone casts a ballot. The militarization of borders and walls inflicts devastating human and environmental costs. The militarization of schools and communities heightens existing vulnerabilities and deepens inequality without making anyone safer. The list goes on. We're rightly concerned as citizens, teachers, parents, neighbors about whether the basic meaning of democracy as ruled by the people has been eviscerated. For political theorists, especially on the left, the obvious answer to these threats is to call for more democracy, to double down, to mount ever more robust defenses of popular rule. If the demos has come undone, then one of the tasks of political theory is to articulate the terms on which the people can reclaim its voice. Without minimizing the urgency of these alarms, which I share, my talk today considers what many political theoretical defenses of democracy, defenses advanced by largely white liberal and radical thinkers, might miss or obscure. To what extent have our demands for the empowerment of ordinary people relied on an uncritical view of the demos or of American political institutions? Is the call for more democracy the best or only response to undemocratic forms of rule? More pointedly, is democracy a defensible ideal in view of its historic and ongoing depredations and its plunder of Black life in particular? Are there other ways to think and other ways of being that exceed conventional repertoires of democratic political thought? Few thinkers illuminate these questions more profoundly, I argue, than Toni Morrison. Although she's best known as a novelist and a literary critic, she was also an ardent advocate for democratic principles and an opponent of repressive regimes. She devoted much of her time as a senior editor at Random House to democratizing the field of American letters. And when she became a celebrated novelist, she used that prominence to urge her fellow writers to protect themselves and each other against authoritarian encroachments and to persist in doing the work that is distinctly theirs, to use their imaginative gifts to translate trauma, cruelty, and exploitation into a shareable language. She was, in the words of Angela Davis and Farah Jasmine Griffin, a revolutionary political thinker. Yet Morrison refuses to venerate democracy, especially in its nation-state form. And she's a keen interpreter of the challenges of sustaining forms of collective life in which everyone is free. Morrison's analysis of the entrenchment of US democracy with racial slavery, colonial dispossession, patriarchy, empire, and capitalism raises uncomfortable questions about how the visions of collective self-governance that are most beloved elide key features of our history. Because her writing emerges through deep relation to Black histories, furthermore, it refuses the forcible forgetting or colonial unknowing that often insulates the idea of democracy from the violence committed in its name. Morrison's writing cautions against enshrining any regime, calls attention to the ways that political membership depends on violent forms of expansion and exclusion, and spins stories from the experiences of women, men, and children who recreate themselves and enact community, with or without political membership, in the face of systemic predation. Her abiding interest in the everyday lives of the unselected, the unchosen, the detritus, those are her words, takes readers into worlds not imagined by most political theories, and lingers in their beauty. Although Morrison is far from the first or only observer to meditate on the twinned birth of modern democracy and white supremacy in what is now the US, her distinctive gift is the way she seizes on that co-creation as an opportunity for imaginative exploration. As she notes in Playing in the Dark, which came out in 1992, quote, living in a nation of people who decided that their worldview would combine agendas for individual freedom and mechanisms for devastating racial oppression presents a singular landscape for a writer. Morrison maps that landscape in 11 novels, in dozens of essays and speeches, and a range of other creative genres. Drawing from deep reservoirs of African American experience, she vivifies the conditions of collective life in the US at different historical moments, from the 17th century to the 21st, and reveals that the demands of equality are steeper than most of us appreciate. Her conviction that the function of freedom is to free someone else, furthermore, suggests why a concept so widely trumpeted is so rarely enacted. In this light, Morrison's repeated appeals to a shareable world gesture beyond the meaning of democracy as government by the people. They provide a critical counterpoint to invocations of modern political forms that forget their kinship with slavery, colonialism, and racialized practices of theft. And they limit the possibilities for coexistence in equality and without the subjection of others. In both of these senses, Morrison's vision of a shareable world aligns with the insurgent work associated with the movement for Black Lives and abolitionist movements that seek to dismantle colonial, capitalist, and carceral structures of power that have made democracy in America so devastating for so many. Like those movements which join their political aspirations to a range of life-affirming and life-tending practices, Morrison's writing dwells in the spaces where people who have been disremembered and unaccounted for create the conditions for more than survival. She paints textured portraits of daily life in the cabins of enslaved people, in tenements and in fine houses, in clearings, fields, and wooded hiding places, where what Jasmine Syedullah calls congregating takes place. Syyedullah's work highlights the emancipatory implications of practices and relations not often recognized as properly political. Breathing, for example, or telling time. My reading of Morrison is indebted to these insights. They press me to try to unsettle the habits ingrained through years of studying, teaching, and writing political theory by trying to, and here I borrow from political theorist Jill Frank, to look at everything everywhere in Morrison's writing. This orientation emphasizes the work of lingering in the language and on the details that reveal something profound about the lives of Morrison's characters. They intimate what it might mean to take seriously her remark that she strives to create work that is unquestionably political and irrevocably beautiful at the same time, without subordinating the beautiful to the political. In the time that remains, I want to pursue this idea in three parts. First, I'll explore how Morrison's understanding of the public role of literature and her account of the relationship of author, text, and readers calls forth a distinctive space of encounter. Approaching her word work as both political and more than political, I argue, opens up new ways to apprehend the beauty and the violence of collective life without sanctifying democracy or forgetting who pays its costs. I developed this idea in the following section by focusing on Morrison's seventh novel, Paradise. Appearing in 1997, Paradise tells the story of the connections and conflicts between two communities, an all-Black town in Oklahoma called Ruby and a multiracial community of outlaw women who live in an abandoned convent nearby. Where Ruby's history mirrors the founding of the US and its glorious aspiration and intrinsic brutality, the women in the convent defy the racial and patriarchal terms of order that are intended to secure the town's freedom. Beyond this contrast, I contend, Paradise vivifies the dangers of aligning freedom dreams with the preservation of a regime and calls readers to pay attention to the small details of human being, the ordinary and extraordinary doings of women and men under duress. Finally, I offer some thoughts about how Morrison's writing incites readers to look beyond existing democratic forms to envision a shareable world. In a 1998 lecture on literature and public life, Morrison remarks that fiction, quote, has features that make it possible to experience the public without coercion and without submission. These features are urgently needed, she explains, in an age when spectacle substitutes for political discourse, when the promise of privacy is undercut by the spread of surveillance technologies, when any notion of the public good has been evacuated by corporate interest, and when all of these developments are entangled with sensationalized conceptions of race and sex. Sound familiar? This was in 1998, but she could have been talking to 2022. Her description of these threats, including, quote, participation in wholly illusory community shaped by fear and unquenchable desire, is all too familiar. When she considers what role literature could play in ameliorating these threats, she surveys three possible responses, three common responses. First, literature builds moral character. Second, it offers a politics-free realm of personal exploration. And third, it educates readers to be better citizens. Morrison is hesitant about each of these responses, and especially wary of the nationalism embedded in democratic conceptions of citizenship. So she looks to her own novels to articulate an alternative path. To say that features of literature make it possible to experience the public without submission is to insist that centering the distinctive histories and aesthetic practices of Black communities gives her work its value, without concern for the regard or disregard of a white public. To say that it is without coercion indicates Morrison's commitment to, quote, that egalitarianism which places us all, the reader, the novel's population, the narrator's voice, on the same footing. Mm-hmm. Early in her career, Morrison emphasizes ways that the beauty and complexity of African-American linguistic forms and cultural traditions infuse and structure her literary art. The challenge she sets herself is, quote, to transfigure the complexity and wealth of Afro-American culture into a language worthy of the culture, evading the traps of explanation, minstrelsy, pornography. Morrison concedes nothing to the expectations of white supremacy. Over time, she becomes more explicit about a complementary dimension of her writing practice, the creation of a language that, in her words, insists on race specificity without race prerogative. Subverting racial categories rather than falling for the allure of an unearned racelessness, Morrison conceives her work as a kind of mapping in which it's possible to imagine individual and collective lives without either denying or being confined to what's given. There's no escape from racially inflected language, Morrison observes, and the work writers do to unhobble the imagination from the demands of that language is complicated, interesting, and definitive. The stakes are very high because words can be used to silence opposition, to destroy self-regard, to protect unjustified power, even to kill. But equally, they can provide pleasure, refuge, critical insight. The beautiful and the political are intertwined insofar as fiction writing is, for Morrison, an intrinsically collaborative process. Her relentless quest for a shareable language is reflected in the many forms in which she experiments. Novels, children's books, libretti, lyrics, essays, reviews, speeches, other kinds of dramatic works, and her attunement to the ways that different registers will resonate with different audiences. Unlike the successful advancement of an argument, she observes, narration requires the active complicity of a reader willing to step outside the established boundaries of the racial imaginary. To say that language is shareable, then, is to insist that her words require the engagement or the complicity of readers for their meaning, and to celebrate the beauty of narration as a collective venture. And if any of you have had the chance to read or to hear or to watch her Nobel lecture, she actually, I think, enacts this idea over the course of the lecture. So I recommend it to all of you. Among the strategies she deploys to invite such participation is what Morrison calls beyond the book gestures. Several of her novels, including Paradise, end with a coda or an afterlife that continues once the main action of the novel is over and instigates what she calls a meditation, debate, argument that needs others for its fullest exploration. When Morrison writes that social acts complete the reading experience, she intimates that literature creates possibilities without guarantees for human connection, connections that both acknowledge and defy the confines of race or gender or class or national affiliation. All this is to say that how we read matters, and in this regard I share Bonnie Honig's view that democratic theorists typically approach the text they interpret through the mode of romance. This happily ever after orientation is often secured by exceptionalizing the racial violence at the heart of US democracy. It is American but not democratic, to quote Alexis de Tocqueville. Or by insulating the present from its grasp. The past is past, to borrow from Herman Melville's Captain Amasa Delano. The alternative Honig proposes is to attend to what she calls our passionate ambivalences about the nation and about democracy in order to become more receptive to difference, to critique, and to the possibility of new configurations of power. Like Morrison's critical writing, Honig's argument provides a vital touchstone for assessing generic moves that insulate American democracy from deep criticism. But I want to explore the possibility that taking Morrison's fiction on its own terms requires more than a genre shift. A further shift, and here I'm quoting from literary scholar Kevin Quashie, a further shift in how we read, what we look for, and what we expect, and even what we remain open to. What might we notice in the work of an artist whose fidelity to the experiences and perceptions of persons no one inquired of exceeds the realm of formal and informal politics? To what extent does a preoccupation with democracy limit our approach to texts in which beauty and politics meet as equals? Does a focus on what a story means for democracy or for theory risk subordinating details that don't lend themselves to new political arrangements or signal a resistance to unjust power? These questions are truly questions. I'm just beginning to think them through, and this paper is more an exploration of them than anything else. My thinking is inspired in part by Kevin Quashie's examination of dimensions of Black culture that are not captured by the expectation of resistance or protest. Quashie does not advocate a refusal of politics, far from it. So this is not a case for quiescence or an anti-politics. Neither is it a romantic anti-politics, I think in the sense of Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's undercommons. Instead, I want to follow Quashie as he insists on the abundance of Black experience, and most vitally interior experience, that is often overlooked in the focus on the forms of resistant expressiveness that challenge an oppressive status quo. Quiet is Quashie's metaphor for what happens in a gesture, a touch, an act of writing or praying, in the complicated tangle of feelings and activities that take place in an unjust world but are never wholly defined by it. Entering the realm of fiction with Morrison enables readers to pursue Quashie's lead, to take up residence without assuming the right of conquest or residence, to dwell in domestic spaces and interior lives far from the seat of power, and possibly to unconfine our thinking in ways that enable the conception of worlds not yet in existence. It engages readers in the contemplation of possibilities that are political and more than political. To think through what this might look like, I now turn to the novel Paradise. And I'm assuming that many of you in the room have not yet had a chance to read it. So I will try to make clear what dimensions of the plot are necessary. There's no expectation that you know the novel. Like Morrison's other novels, Paradise tells a political story in an intimate register. It imagines how a group of African-American families who moved to what was then called by the US, Oklahoma Territory, in the pursuit of freedom unavailable in the post-Civil War South, struggles to preserve a self-sufficient way of life in the face of a hostile world. Rejected by lighter-skinned, white, and indigenous neighbors during their journey, they limit their membership in the town they call Haven to their descendants. And when those descendants do the same after World War II, when they refound the community with a new name, Ruby, in an even more remote part of what had become the state of Oklahoma. Paradise begins with the Bicentennial Massacre. In July 1976, 9 men from Ruby hunt and kill the 5 women who live in the convent. And the remainder of the novel intertwines the individual stories of these 9 men, 5 women, and many others, characters who are in different ways seeking refuge from racist and sexual violence, from personal disappointment, and from insecurity in the American West. At one level, Paradise is the story of emancipatory projects gone awry. Morrison disrupts progressive histories that mark the Civil War as the end of slavery, and she troubles political pronouncements on the left and the right that glory in the conquest of a continent. In a foreword that was published in 2014, Morrison tells that Paradise was inspired by newspaper accounts of a post-Civil War land rush in which African Americans sought to establish new lives on the territory from which Native inhabitants had been brutally removed by white settlers and the US government. She imagines what she calls a gated community of people who've been refused entry elsewhere on account of their blackness and their lack of wealth, and who establish a place where they can be free and protected. By creating a modern paradise, a Black paradise, Morrison's aim is to craft a story that is rooted in history, but not confined by it, to treat race, in her words, as a non-signifier, to explore the tensions between a desire for borderlessness and a reliance on walls and weapons, to consider the dangers of the wish for permanent happiness. What the people of Ruby seek is their own form of ordered liberty, the possibility of living their lives as they choose, unmolested by outsiders who take their blackness as justification for exploitation, violence, or disregard. They imagine Ruby as a place where the boys can grow to manhood, quote, unshot, unlynched, unmolested, unimprisoned, close quote. And a woman can leave her house in the middle of the night and wander freely, knowing, and here I quote again, nothing for 90 miles around thought she was prey. Both forms of freedom have their costs. The young men of Ruby go to war and come back, damaged or not at all, or else they remain in the town where their desires are stifled by the rigid expectations of their male elders. For women, the price of freedom is submission to the authority of fathers and husbands. If they never have to endure the indignity or physical risk of working among or for white people, neither can they fully explore the possibility of intellectual or sexual independence. So when a multiracial group of lively, free, unarmed females, that's the language of the novel, takes up residence just beyond Ruby's perimeter, their presence is interpreted as a challenge, ultimately a mortal one, to the existing order. Unmoved by the town's rules, the convent women come and go. They flirt with and seduce members of the community of the Ruby. They subvert patriarchal authority by providing reproductive care and counsel to women in need, and they appear unconstrained by existing racial categories. Where the town's founders imagine their new land in the West as a place of freedom without borders, the willfulness of these women reveals the rigidity of the borders on which Ruby relies. Like other earthly paradises, the one all-Black town worth the pain depends on the dispossession of prior occupants, and the value of the people's freedom depends in part on their distinction from anyone not recognizably descended from the original families. Although the leaders of Ruby do not extol violence for its own sake or seek the kind of limitless expansion that's been synonymous with white freedom in the US, their utopia nonetheless relies on a distinctive form of necropolitics. On the one hand, the town denies its own members' susceptibility to death by refusing to establish a cemetery within its borders. And on the other, its identity is sustained by a willingness to kill outsiders, or in the case of a white family that passes through in the winter and succumbs to exposure, to let them die. As Erica Edwards observes, Morrison's novel re-revises Exodus as a violent trope for the articulation of the Black Liberation Project. In many respects, Paradise reproduces key features of canonical American narratives about the creation of new people on new land, while also vivifying the violence that project entails and that canonical literatures often disavow. Mm-hmm. When Morrison writes, and this is in Playing in the Dark, that the flight from the old world to the new is generally seen to be a flight from oppression and limitation to freedom and possibility, she reveals how that freedom and possibility rely on a series of contrasts. In the case of the founding of the US, with the enslaved Africans whose presence enhanced the worth of white freedom, with the indigenous occupants of what was called empty land, whose erasure enabled its conversion to property, and with the world that they left behind in Europe. Just as these European men and women were drawn across the Atlantic by what Morrison calls a kind of dignity believed unprecedented in the world, the families of Ruby seek a new form of freedom and prosperity, whose value is accentuated by its distance from the terrors of the US South and its members' difference from anyone living beyond their bounds. There are also crucial respects in which Morrison's telling of the story of Ruby does not mirror national founding myths or the ongoing conquest of the West. First, Morrison's writing disallows gestures through which slavery and other forms of anti-Black oppression are remembered by forgetting indigenous dispossession. As Taya Miles remarks, quote, Morrison does not conjure vestiges of Indianness on the landscape that only signal indigenous absence. In addition to naming the prior occupants of the land that becomes First Haven and then Ruby, Morrison enlaces her account of Black escape from the racist polity with a history of Native kidnapping by the same polity. By opening with an epigraph from a Gnostic poem whose feminine voice recalls a discredited early Christian tradition, furthermore, Morrison indicates the importance of female wisdom that counters the masculinism of many democratic dreams. And Paradise also contests history that confused capitalism with freedom, detailing the empty lives of Ruby's most prosperous residents and the violence of accumulation. Morrison undercuts historical narratives in which the life of Black enterprise is more valuable than Black life itself. While the novel unsettles conceptions of paradise that mistake exclusion for freedom, that sanctify male authority, and that confuse property with the worth of human life, it also cautions against assuming that a household permeated with a blessed malelessness, I love that phrase, is a site of uncomplicated liberation. Life in the convent is precarious and often conflict-ridden, and the women who live there are selfish, frightened, arrogant, and jealous, as well as beautiful. The convent itself is a jumble. A gaudy statuary and vintage wines from the period when it was a gambler's house are mixed with austere remnants of the nuns' existence and the working kitchen and gardens that sustain its current residents. The novel lingers on mundane and often contradictory details of daily life. The preparation and taste of meals, dancing to Killing Me Softly on the radio, quote, first apart, imagining partners, then partnered, imagining each other, close quote. Finding physical comfort in the backseat of a Cadillac, fighting in the dirt, selling hot peppers and pecans to neighbors in Ruby, and more. Amid these images, what emerges is a picture of the convent as a site of relation, a place where women who were supposed to be enemies offer each other friendship, and women who think they are broken experiment with their own healing. And I want to offer two very quick vignettes from the novel. One of the most complicated friendships develops between Consolata, or Connie, who's one of the women living in the convent, and Soane, the wife of one of Ruby's leading men. Initially, their sharing is unsought, and actually Morrison emphasizes sharing is set off in the novel. So here we have a different vision of a shareable world. Their sharing is unsought because they both love Soane's husband. But it grows into something else. After Consolata refuses to help Soane end an unwanted pregnancy, after she saves one of Soane's sons from injuries in a car accident, and after Soane arrives at the convent with a basket of sugar cookies, thanks, and advice. Out of profound loss and misunderstanding, they conjure together something like a shareable world. As the narrator observes, they traded that basket back and forth for years. The second example is what Morrison calls loud dreaming, a collective practice through which the residents of the convent attempt to repair themselves and each other. Lying naked on drawings of themselves on the cold floor of the cellar, they lose track of time and call forth the lost joys and the unspeakable abuses that brought them there. Although their language is only intermittently intelligible and their stories quite different from each other, the merging of memories and sounds affects a form of deep equality. The massacre cuts off these dreaming sessions, but Morrison encourages readers to stay with them in their abundance, to suspend a desire for clear outcomes, and to dream with her characters about how a touch, a smell, the act of cooking or harvesting, the making of sound or its absence might constitute a kind of redress in the darkest of times. Fittingly, Paradise both begins and ends in ambiguity. The opening line, "They shoot the white girl first," activates a series of questions. Who are they? Which character is the white girl? The first question is answered over the course of the novel, but Morrison deliberately leaves the second one hanging. Her point is not to highlight racial identity, but to get it out of the way. Unconstrained, she remarks, by the weary and wearying vocabulary of racial domination, the narrative seeks to unencumber itself from the limits that racial language imposes on the imagination. Beyond this, the novel's ambiguities summon the reader, in Morrison's words, and elicit her or his participation in the writing of the story. Where the opening pages detail the murders of the women, the ending extends the role of the reader beyond the page by raising questions, including, did the slaughter actually take place? No bodies are recovered from the scene, and the final section of the novel imagines the 5 convent women reconnecting with people from earlier phases of their lives. The coda gives us a short passage about each of them, seeing or being seen by someone they once loved and finding succor or offering consolation where they once experienced violence or rejection. It rescripts women who have been regarded as detritus, as daughters, as mothers, as loved. There's something satisfying in these stories, and one way to read them is to ask whether the experiments in redress practiced within the walls of the convent enable them to move towards something like their own liberation. Alternatively, these sightings of presumed to be dead characters conjure what Morrison elsewhere calls rememory, an embodied relation to the past that does not allow the indulgence of regret or nostalgia, but creates what she calls, and here I quote, a very thin, but not so frail possibility of hope for the present. These are just some of the possibilities. For Morrison's beyond the book gesture goes beyond the critique of oppressive forms of earthly paradise to engage the reader in considering with her what else there might be to say about the individual and collective lives she's imagined. What, for example, does the future hold for the town of Ruby? Maybe it will survive, as its predecessor did not, but it cannot do so by resisting change or by burnishing the myth of its own specialness and burying its crimes. In a silent meditation over the grave of a child, a young minister who is often at odds with Ruby's leadership reflects, how exquisitely human was the wish for permanent happiness, and how thin human imagination became trying to achieve it. Soon, Ruby will be like any other country town. The young thinking of elsewhere, the old full of regret. The sermons will be eloquent, but fewer and fewer will pay attention or connect them to everyday life. How can they hold it together, he wondered, this hard-won heaven, defined only by the absence of the unsaved, the unworthy, and the strange? Who will protect them from their leaders? If there is a future for Ruby, the silent sermon intimates, it begins with the people who are willing to step outside the confines of the town's controlling story. Maybe with a young woman whose grandmother was not part of one of the founding families, a lineage that makes her suspect to her neighbors, and who dearly misses the convent women. Maybe it's with the mother of the dead child, who refuses to adhere to the town's belief in its own immortality and demands the establishment of a cemetery within Ruby's borders. Maybe with one of the leading men who is undone by his participation in the murders and wonders what kind of a livable life is possible after so much destruction. Or with the minister himself, though enraged by Ruby's residents and repulsed by their mythologies, he concludes, here I quote, "There was no better battle to fight, no better place to be than among these outrageously beautiful, flawed, and proud people." Looking back on the novel 20 years after its publication, Morrison observes that, and here I'm quoting, "amid all of the struggle, chaos, and unbreakable conflict caused by power distribution within classifications of race and gender, I hope to draw attention to specific individuals trying to escape harm and mitigate their failures, one narrative at a time." In its deliberate refusal of easy summary or distillation into generalizable lessons, Paradise does not present clear alternatives for our consideration. Even the juxtaposition of the convent and Ruby is full of ambiguity. While the shortcomings of Ruby's existence are obvious, and there's this wonderful line where the narrator asks, how could so clean and blessed a mission devour itself and become the world they had escaped? Despite these shortcomings, the disorganized life of the convent doesn't offer a clear alternative. More importantly, their complicated entanglements defy any strict separation between Ruby's world of ordered liberty and the wayward lives that threaten it. As a literary and social critic with an abiding commitment to the empowerment of ordinary people, Morrison is clear-eyed and unromantic about the damage that any demos can do to itself and to others. She insists that readers contend with racialized dispossession, violence, and disregard that undergird so many dreams of freedom and equal membership. As a novelist, Morrison does more. Looking at everything, everywhere in Morrison's writing orients readers toward possibilities of collective life that exceed the conventional terms of political theories, and stages encounters with people who sometimes enact modes of relation that are more beautiful than democracy. Reading Paradise in 2022, against a backdrop of warnings that democratic life may be in mortal peril, presses us to grapple with the ways that democracy is conceived and practiced in the United States has always posed a danger to Black, Indigenous, and other lives and life worlds, and to pay attention to the fullness of those lives and life worlds. In lieu of doubling down on the importance of democratic faith, Morrison goes exploring, imagining the complicated day-to-day doings and interior lives of the polity's throwaway people as they try and frequently fail to create a shareable world under enormous duress and out of the resources at hand. What this means for readers is by no means given. What is given instead is the story and the invitation to participate in its completion by taking up what the narrator of the novel calls, quote, the endless work we were created to do down here in paradise. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Balfour. Now we'll hear from, sorry, come on up, okay. Professor Syedullah, and then we'll hear from Professor Taylor.
Greetings, thank you so much. This has been such an honor, and it takes a long time to get back with your people after, you graduate from graduate school, and it's even more time that it takes during the pandemic. So this has been a long time in the making, so just grateful to be here. Thank you so much to everyone who made it possible. So I want to begin today with a meditation on the moment and the provocation that Dr. Balfour centered us towards towards the start of her talk, quoting Morrison's essay Home from 1997 and this anthology, The House That Race Built, Black Americans in U.S. Terrain. Unlike the successful advancement of an argument, narration requires the active complicity of a reader willing to step outside established boundaries of a racial imaginary. I watched folks' faces at that one, and it was a good one. I'm glad it landed, but I wanted to bring it back. The notion that narrated storytelling animates forms of democratic praxis is in no way novel. We are all familiar with the ways allegory, parable, and myth are deployed in political theories and philosophies of authoritative power to define the range and limits of its reach. However, narrative storytelling lives in the world, not of memorializing forms of power from above, but memorializing the everyday, the intimate spaces of relation and regard that we call home. Storytelling helps us keep account of what counts in the world as it is from the places where we can stand it enough to bear witness. Some stories even help us hold open the possibility that we might not be okay Hold open the possibility that we might be okay if we can learn to be okay with what we don't know, can't see, while just getting enough information to keep pressing on. These are the kinds of stories Morrison narrates for us. Last week, my campus hosted a visit by Eddie Glaude, who name-dropped Balfour at the beginning of his talk when he was talking about the people who are in his legacy. After he mentioned his teachers, he mentioned that you were in his cohort in graduate school. And I got to ask him a question about where he is seeing this kind of transformation. I asked him about integrity and where we're seeing integrity practiced in the everyday. Kind of breaking from our conditioned training towards something other than whiteness or anti-Blackness or fear and enclosure. And he talked about the work of movement building that's happening in the South, led by Black and Indigenous, Native folks and Latin American folks, towards another kind of politics that's being done from the periphery and really starting to shape the mainstream just south of us in Arizona. But then he leaned back in his chair and reflected further, turning to a connection between Morrison's beloved, specifically Seth's love poem on page 103, he was sure to add, in The Clearing, and in its connection to the choice of inhabiting the monstrosity of the flesh opened up in Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. The choice to inhabit monstrosity instead of innocence or purity or some other kind of idealized sentiment of romantic kinship is instructive here. I actually find the experience of storytelling myself kind of tough to stay with because I'm so desperately enamored with the moral, the reach for resolution, the takeaway, the point. But what I'm learning from these conversations with Morrison by way of my esteemed colleagues is that there may be something to the patience that comes from the practice of prolonged attention and the time narration takes sometimes, the reading and the rereading, to understand, right? The practice of return to the narration that's even more informative, perhaps, than the point of the story itself, the relationship between ourselves and those authors that we take the time to tend to. Becoming conditioned to believe tragedy will resolve, or that my beliefs demand affirmation, or that there must always be a reason for things isn't a personal failing of mine. It's our Western classical conditioning, an algorithm, a habit, an orientation, a practice. While the allegory, parable, and myth serve to buttress the fortitude of some dominant master narrative, some hegemonic universalizing truths, narrative storytelling reveals the sublime of small things and how we can be undone by them. It requires a habit of return that takes time to embody and practice to hone, which is why we all come here, right, as a regular practice. It is a practice of turning our attention towards indeterminacy, curiosity, and witness, and often asks us to defer our desires for and attachments to sure footing, certainty, and clear roles and directives. You might not know what to do or where to go or who's gonna do what, but you know you gotta keep it moving. So I resonate with the call to contemplate with Balfour on what bearing narrative storytelling has on the task of political theory in this time. In this time, some may call apocalyptic. While the end games of end times seem more cyclical than final, what we do know is that the stories we've learned to tell about who we are as a nation and how we got here matter. And we just might have to fight for the right to narrate our national narratives ourselves. Quote, if the demos has come undone, poses Balfour, then one of the tasks of political theory is to articulate the terms on which the people can reclaim its voice. At the heart of the questions of futurity her paper raises, Lawrie, I hear a deep prophetic concern for the wrongs to come and a loss of the faith in the political tools and practices and protocols that we have on hand. Faith that there will be enough to give us just enough information to keep pressing on. To build on Audre Lorde's read and witness, the tools of democratic praxis we forged in the fires of the Enlightenment and Western Empire to expand this modern political project in the name of lifting up what we might call the sanctity of the human condition above the sovereignty of monarchs and landlords. These tools are failing us, and we are flailing in the wake of our trust in them to keep us together, to keep us safe, and to provide for future generations. Rather than yield to all the encompassing overwhelm and defeat of this effective aporia we seem stuck in, flailing in, Balfour, by way of Morrison, invites us into another democratic practice, one of prophetic read, witness, and storytelling about the kinds of freedom we call home, a tradition of course correction from below that can be tracked back through the archive of the anti-slavery abolitionists' push to narrate the conditions of slavery from the positions of those most directly impacted by it, most directly shaped by it. Paradise, in this sense, is a kind of estranged cousin then of the slave narrative. Or as Balfour pointed out, quoting Erica Edwards' observation of Morrison's novel, a re-revision of Exodus as a violent trope for the articulation of the Black Liberation Project. If y'all are thinking about Wakanda, so am I. I am still only partway through the book. It's really long and takes a lot of patience of return, which is why I started with that as a practice that we might be losing, particularly during the pandemic. But one of the lines that really stated this point most clearly to me was a line from a meeting between a first meeting between two characters, one whom you've already been introduced to, Connie, and a second, Mavis. So Connie is in a rural area, in this rural area, and Mavis has walked hours and hours before finding Connie. Her car was broke down miles away. Mavis is lost and afraid of how she'll find her way, and she asks about how she can get some resources and says, "Y'all ain't scared out here by yourselves?" And Mavis says, oh, that's what Mavis asked, and Connie laughed. "Scary things, not always outside. Most scary things is inside." I think that becomes our mantra for today. Much like the frontierism of the Old West, Ruby is a town in which, as Balfour writes, the town's founders imagine their new land in the West as a place of freedom without borders. What that elicits will become clear in a moment. Ideologically expansive, but practically partitioned, Rudy's foundation is an all too familiar place of sublating the truth of contradiction within an origin story told to distract from the world of the town as it is and redirect attention to the preservation of the ideals rather than coach our capacity to return to attend to information present within the everyday, all the evidence that might be needed to tell what time it is and act accordingly. En masse, if possible. Listening to her talk through the contradictions that constitute collective political identity, we hear Balfour offer us the language of economics to consider the function of freedom in this context, lest we be distracted by all the signs and signification of belonging that may require of us or promise us. After all, where the proverbial rubber meat grinds the road is in the economic implications of our most colorful ideals. As we watch, in the current moment, what we see is the value of market logics overtaking the sanctity of the human condition, acutely targeting those relegated to the margins of the franchise, certainly, but what we're also seeing and what's being revealed to know no bounds, to reiterate that point, is that across differences of race, place, national belonging and recognition, money moves trump mass social movements with all the veracity of a well-fueled locomotive. Thanks to COVID, environmental collapse, and increasing displacement and gentrification in city centers, the fetishized worship at the altar of the almighty armed life, and the license it gives to those with the will to wield weapons without regard for the human or psychic costs, we see how efficiently the machines of modernity and social contract turn monuments to an older economic order, an artifact of the classical Greek divisions of labor in the home, are then being extended to map the current body politic. And this is just, so in the book, in the essay you quote from the book saying, "For women, the price of freedom is submission to the authority of fathers and husbands." And this kind of cyclical relationship of sublation is not just particular, but systemic. The price and cost of freedom and paradise are dignity, wholeness, consent to domination, the optic shift as the residents retreat from white law to black homestead, but the economic logics that organize their everyday lives stay the same. So Stuart Schrader, in a 2020 essay entitled "The Harm of the Law," notes that there is a cultural notion of economy embedded in the root of our reliance on policing to keep home, hearth, and neighborhood safe from the scary things outside. Quoting the legal scholar Marcus D. Dubber, he writes, "Policing meant governing the state as a household for the sake of its public police and economy." So if the concept of the household implied the existence of a householder or patriarch, Schrader reasons, in contemporary usage economy without police attached to it disavows any sense of who governs the economy and how and why. What Balfour is prompting me to consider in conversation with this burgeoning field of carceral studies is it asks about the politics beyond the political, right? The politics beyond the political that we are willing to practice for a shared sense of security. What are we practicing? What about the role of sacrifice at play in both efforts to shore up and maintain and justify hegemonic mechanisms for securing freedom, while also requiring sacrifice live at the center of our liberation and rebellion forms within those mechanisms of common law and order? What do I mean? We work hard to make sure people are not dying at the hands of the police, but we do so at the sacrifice to our own well-being. Meanwhile, they're sacrificing our well-being in order to maintain the status quo that says law and order must prevail, and these are just casualties of that ideal, right? So why sacrifice? Sacrifice the threat to save the society, sacrifice ourselves to save society. In both stories of freedom, there is an economic order which prevails. The practice of storytelling we have inherited situates strategies for the securing of freedom as a political project that moves at the register of our attention to the moral virtues as a formalized ideal while distracting us from the everyday functions of its material effects, ethics, and praxis. Despite the fact that the stakes of our orientations and investments in the concept are more practical than sentimental, what we see when we look to national politics is how deeply out of practice we are in telling stories about freedom that center everyday ethics over universalizing moral virtues. Just this past weekend, in a panel discussion titled Feminism Against Empire, convened in celebration of the life and work of Bell Hooks on her first birthday since her death at the end of 2021, Joy James posed a question to her fellow panelists that kind of blew my mind, so I'm going to take a couple more minutes of my time to just share it with you. The panel proceeded fairly familiarly, with accolades of Hooks' constitutive contributions to Black feminist theory and methods of analysis that audit domination in its multiple registers and identities, critiques of imperial hegemonic white feminism of Stuart Hall, the limits of cultural studies, how Hooks' rise from Appalachia to the academy shaped her analysis of power. But then Joy James pipes up with a candid confession that she's not nearly as compassionate a critic as Bell is a scholar and theorist. And then she places Hooks in the world. She cites a quote of one of her teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh, who Joy reminded us taught us that we need political practices that prepare us for the wars we see coming 10 years in the future. She links Bell Hooks to Pablo Freire in Brazil and his learnings of pedagogy from communities in Africa and struggles against colonialism there, and the sidelining of Dr. King by the Black bourgeoisie who didn't know how to deal with King once he lifted his critical gaze to US empire and class politics. But then she says, quote, "There are limits to forgiveness. When I see the structural violence, when I read her, Bell Hooks, I appreciate her, but I have to stop reading. Because the violence from a predator state seems to exceed the capacity of what appears on the page. I'm not sure when our morality overtakes the ethics of our struggle." And it was that line that stopped me in my tracks, and I had to stop listening and write it down. I'm not sure when our morality takes over the ethics of our struggle. Like Morrison, when I heard James asking us to consider all of the ways the concept of the political can live in excess of the binary frames we use to analyze and classify it, I was reminded of this week's class that I was teaching just a couple days ago, where we were reflecting on the mimetic effects of policing through the intimate and familiar spaces and places we call home. We were thinking about the contradictions that are so strikingly constitutive of our political identities and our relationships to power, authority, privacy, and protection. As much as some of us may long for spaces of refuge from the unrelenting disregard and degradation of white heteropatriotic capitalist supremacy, even within affinity groups, we seem perpetually haunted by those who seek to rehearse the role of hunter. Long enough distance cannot secure our freedom from those unseemly unfortunates from whom we do not, with whom we do not want to identify. And so James went on, we are implicated in the terror we wish to flee. I worry that we don't have the political language to get ready for the kinds of wars that are coming, to bring back Thich Nhat Hanh. So enters more beautiful than democracy, Toni Morrison's idea of a shareable world as rendered through the read and witness of Professor Balfour, which invites us into a practice of contemplating the why the preservation of an ideal ought to come at the cost of compromising the human condition in both political projects waged in the name of progress and those waged in the name of protest. We might find ourselves stuck and flailing in a loop of sacrifice, death-ridden, death worship that is nothing short of the creed of the cannibal. So as you may recall in closing, my scholarship sits with the word, witness, and read of formerly fugitive, formerly enslaved, abolitionist, ever abolitionist, mother, soldier, teacher, friend, Miss Harriet Ann Jacobs. One of the greatest truths she taught me about the history of my social location on this land is that there is no place within its bounds that can provide safe harbor for two-spirited flesh. And two-spirit as T-O-O, not T-O-W, but there might be some resonances there to explore. For the cost is too high, so we must steel our resolve to steal ourselves, and we cannot do so alone. Such piracy requires a crew. Jacobs referred to them throughout her 1861 narrative story of escape from slavery as her friends. This nameless network conspired to steal themselves back from the jaws of hell. And what's especially worth noting here is that not all of them stood to benefit as individuals on the same scale. In fact, some were not even bound by the matrilineal reproduction of coercively racialized labor. Some were free blacks working in the South. Some were white women with property. Some were wives, white women, widows. Others were enemies of the state. They were all risking reputation for the right to protect the places they fought to call home, rather than a preservation of existing property. This struggle for home was mediated by less of a preservation of an ideal and more of a prophetic investment in a relationship of homecoming not yet realized. To quote the end of Jacob's narrative and her acknowledgement that though legally emancipated, the dream of her life had not yet been realized. Evidence of her desire for another kind of freedom than that which she would be gifted or bartered to secure is echoed throughout the narrative, throughout the archive of self-narrated stories of escape from slavery. I want to suggest that it is this witness that is passed on and bared by their literary and figurative descendants when I hear Balfour return our attention to Morrison's conviction, the function of freedom is to free someone else. At the end of the day, the questions Bell, Jacobs, Morrison, Joy James, Balfour, Eddie Glaude, along with a nameless network of far less recognizable friends, got me asking myself is, who are your people? Who claims you and who do you claim? Who is at your back and whose do you have? How are we keeping close enough account of what counts when we think about, anticipate when they will come for us and who they might come for, that we will be ready with the read and the witness to pass down to future generations the dreams of our life not yet realized? In conversation with Carl Schmitt's concept of the political this past week, I also had my students read the Combahee River Collective Statement and Leanne Simpson's I Am Not a Nation State from her book, As We Have Always Done, in which she introduces us to the ethics that live within us and in the land and our relationships we have to our mutually assured survival to thriving together. She calls this ecologies of intimacy, and it's not just her, but it's her people, that reveals that the limits of even a radically intersectional analysis of political identity. It's a story that returns us to what it means to be in right relationship with that which makes us possible. The natural resources that we call home thrived while we were quarantined. And it just made me wonder if regular global quarantine might not be just what we need, the first time out of necessity, the second time perhaps by choice, and then perhaps as a planetary practice. Thanks.
Professor Taylor?
I should begin by echoing the thanks that have been offered to those who are responsible for this event. Grateful to Stephen for his patience, grateful to the good folks who work in this building for making this beautiful facility available to us and welcoming us here. And I'm grateful to all of you for being here. I'm pleased to have the chance to comment on Lawrie Balfour's lecture today. I've had the privilege of learning from her brilliant written work on Du Bois and Baldwin and Morrison. It's an honor to join her now in conversation as her thinking on Morrison continues to evolve. The argument of her lecture strikes me as importantly right on a great many of its particulars. I worry a little, though, about how we get to the particulars. Worry's too strong, given my broad sympathy with so much of what Professor Balfour has said. So I'll invite you to hear the word worry accompanied by scare quotes or an asterisk. I worry about how we get to the particulars, the narrower points of emphasis, because important, broader points may get short shrift along the way. I'll try to say more about this over the next few minutes. It's one thing to read a lecture, it's another thing to listen to it. It's another thing to be in the space in which the lecture is performed and presented. Listening to the lecture, I fervently wish I had other things to say than what I'm going to say now. What I'm going to say will seem peevish and nitpicky, but I want to make sure I get the argument. And once I get the argument, I might have other things to say. I spend most of my life as a philosophical esthetician, and I have recently been encouraged to think harder about what reading is and requires, especially in relation to figures like Martin King and Frank Wilderson and Saidiya Hartman. So I would desperately love to be able to say something about how reading works and how my views on that might bear on the argument we've heard. But instead, I'll be nitpicky, so I'll beg your indulgence. So first, to recap. Professor Balfour says, and I'm quoting her now, that her talk, quote, considers what many political theoretical defenses of democracy miss or obscure, end of quote. These defenses decline to ask and fail to notice the importance of questions like these, quoting her once more. She changed the question from the one I read to the one she asked, so my response may change. The one I read was, is it possible to demand the empowerment of ordinary people without recourse to an uncritical view of the demos? The one she read for us just now was, to what extent do our valorizations of the demos depend on uncritical? This makes a difference in ways you will see. Maybe that's why she changed it. Here's another question she asked, quoting once more, is democracy a defensible ideal in view of its historic and ongoing depredations and its plunder of black life in particular, end of quote. Professor Balfour is determined to ask these questions as a way, she says, of unsettling certain habits that have taken root in her scholarly and teacherly persona and in the field of political theory. She wants to recruit the work of Morrison into her reflections on these questions because, as she puts it, quoting once more, few thinkers illuminate these questions more profoundly, end of quote. As I hear the argument, Morrison's profundity is rooted in four big moves. Here's the nitpicky part. I'm just going to. First, she refuses to venerate democracy, despite being an ardent advocate for democratic principles. She always keeps in view the entanglements linking U.S. democracy with the various injustices of modernity's racial projects and colonial regimes. Call this a desanitizing move. This is me, not Lawrie, because of its refusal to accept an artificially sanitized vision of democracy. Second move, Morrison refuses to let modern political projects and regimes get away with disremembering the people they've oppressed. She dwells on and in the lives of the unchosen and the unselected to show both that the democracy we claim to know is rooted in, is somehow committed to violence and injustice, and to show that the people who suffered from the violence and bore the injustices also built lives and communities and made beauty and found joy. Think of this as an exercise in remembrance. A third key move involves the way Morrison carries out these exercises in desanitization and remembrance. Balfour writes, quoting once more, although Morrison is far from the first or only observer to meditate on the twin birth of democracy and white supremacy, her distinctive gift is the way she seizes on that co-creation as an opportunity for imaginative exploration, end of quote. Morrison seizes this opportunity in particular, we hear, by mapping the landscape of America's contradictory here-invoked democracy in the world-making exercises of creative literary writing. This third move, this imaginative exploratory mapping, enables a fourth, a series of gestures at, quoting once more, the possibilities for coexistence in equality and without the subjection of others, end of quote. think of this fourth move as a way of reanimating the idea of non-oppressive social arrangements. Morrison undertakes this reanimation both by depicting social life in ways that invite readers to reflect on alternatives to current arrangements, but also by approaching the work of literature in a way that models non-hierarchical social relations. I'm not sure I follow this last point about the work of literature modeling certain social relations. It runs through Morrison's own reflections on the work of narration. I think I may differ with my colleagues and with Morrison on how narration works and how far away from argument it is, but I'll return to this. So these four elements, desanitizing, reanimating, re-remembrance, and that's hard to say, re-remembrance, and imaginative mapping, are crucial to making sense of Morrison's idea of a shareable world. This idea gives Balfour her point of entry, as you've seen, as well as her title, though for reasons I confess to finding a trifle obscure. I think it goes like this. I'll invite Professor Balfour or anyone else here to correct me if this is not how it goes. In order to share a world with others, one has to take seriously the other's experience of the world. In order to share a world in the wake of modern racialism's determination to cleave the world into irreconcilable pieces, one has to accept that others, racialized, historically subordinated others, actually inhabit one's world, and that they can participate in the work of world-making that just is human social life. Mm-hmm. One has to accept, in addition, that the racialized other can have experiences, and that these experiences matter. Here we come to the core of Balfour's argument about Morrison's contribution. It isn't just that Morrison imaginatively explores the worlds that the slaves and their descendants made. It's that she does this in a way that, quoting once more, engages readers in the contemplation of possibilities that are political and more than political, end of quote. Mm-hmm. The more than political side of this formulation puzzles me a little, so I'm going to be nitpicky again. I think it means at least three things beyond the gestures at alternative political forms that we've already seen. The first one involves imagining, experimenting with orientation to social life that depart from existing political concepts and frameworks, including but not limited to racial categories and ideologies. The second, crediting the richness of human experience apart from its political modes. This is where Professor Balfour turns to what I would call critical race aesthetics, but what Kevin Quashie refers to as the quiet abundance of Black experience. Recognizing with Professor Quashie that we are more than our protest, we are more than our resistance, is a way of taking seriously the other's capacity for world-making and for experience beyond the political. Third thing that I think the language of beyond the political involves is experimenting with modes of reading that decline to emulate politically charged orientations to human interaction. This goes back to the thing I said I didn't understand earlier. This involves, I think, reading collaboratively, openly, humbly. It involves accepting the co-constitution of the work and its world by writer, reader, and text. Perhaps most important for Balfour, it involves resisting the practice of committed reading that encourages the political theorist to look only for explicitly political lessons in a narrative. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's the right way to read the argument, so my first question for Lawrie is just whether I'm properly tracking the discussion. If I am, and even if I'm just close, I have some other questions. So here we go. First question, or second one. The first one is, am I getting this right? Second question, so what? Or, who are you talking to? That's a riff on a long, glorious footnote in a piece by Fred Moten, where he destroys Paul Gilroy. It's gorgeous. Anyway. And he uses like curse words, who the blank are you talking to? It's glorious. Anyway, one way to receive this argument is as a reminder that novels are more than political tracts, and that reading them as more than political tracts can give us insight into the stakes and proper place of politics. But we knew that. Political theorists, it appears, don't or need to be reminded that they know this and that they should govern themselves accordingly. Hence Professor Balfour's early remark about unsettling sedimented habits. But is this really the motivation or context for the argument? Are political theorists really this single-minded in their reading of literary works? Maybe they are, and maybe I'm just asking you to confirm that this is, in fact, that things are as bad as all that. I put nothing past my fellow academics, after all. So I'm wondering if that's really what motivates the argument. Beyond this request for confirmation that things really are as bad as that, I wonder about the broader lessons that we're meant to take away, those of us who aren't tempted, who were never tempted, to read Morrison in a way that screens off the rich interrogation of extra-political experience, right? This rich phenomenological engagement. maybe my concern is less about broader lessons. That's what I said. I'm wondering about the broader lessons. Might be less about broader lessons than about the way to frame this lesson, about the possibility of framing this lesson as a repudiation of a kind of systematically produced innocence or ignorance, which is an epistemic intervention, which hasn't quite emerged in the conversation yet in this way, which brings me to my next question. Question number 2, is that it? It won't surprise you to learn that I think Morrison definitely has broader lessons for the rest of us, or with broader in scare quotes, because I'm not sure it's actually broad breadth that I'm interested in. It won't surprise you to learn that I think there are broader lessons for the rest of us. I know Professor Balfour knows this. But again, I wonder why certain of those lessons have played no role in this discussion so far. A few moments in the lecture encouraged me to ask this question. For example, Professor Balfour says that Morrison uses American contradictions as, quoting her now, an opportunity for imaginative exploration. But as I read Morrison, especially as I read essays like Sites of Memory, it's worse or better than this. It's not just about opportunity, it's necessity, right? The contradictions of American here-invoked democracy require imaginative exploration engagement. They require that Morrison engages in what she calls literary archaeology, which uses the imagination to locate and examine and excavate sites of disremembering, of enforced silence, of motivated forgetting, of what Baldwin calls innocence, right? In order to recover and reconstitute disremembered lives and people. It's not opportunity, it's a necessity. Similarly, Professor Balfour says that Morrison maps the landscape of US politics and history. But again, taking the idea of literary archaeology as seriously as Morrison seems to want us to, one has to say she doesn't just map the terrain, she digs into it. She digs beneath it to uncover and recover what the familiar maps have glossed over. But to speak of glossing over doesn't really capture it any more than the language of mapping does. Morrison provides a corrective to the epistemic injustice of denying the witness, testimony, and voice of the disremembered. With all that said, my question is what happens to this Morrison on Balfour's reading? She's in there somewhere, but I wonder why this, in some ways more challenging epistemic intervention isn't the key to the work of reading and narration that we've heard so much about. Now, I realize it may seem that I'm quibbling over which words and metaphors to use, mapping versus digging, opportunity versus necessity, but I think there's something at stake here, you can tell me if you disagree, something related to the way literature can be and do theory, while also continuing to be and do literature. This bears further thought. Third question, why exactly does Professor Balfour think her Morrison is so different from the Du Bois of the criteria of Negro art address? It occurs to me now that I'm talking about a footnote that you didn't read and that she didn't talk about. So I'll skip this one. So, moving right along. I have a great deal to say about this if you'd like to talk about it, but moving right along. We'll come back to
I
it.
included the footnote partly here.
Just
You
for
had
me,
to
okay.
See what
Thank
you
you
had
for
to
that.
say about it.
That's very nice, thank you. Question 4. Everyone's worried about inflation. Aren't you worried about inflation too? I'm thinking here not of our current economic discourse, but about the opposite of what some philosophers call deflationism. That's a name for the philosophical impulse to call out the refusal of contingency and of vagueness and of provisionality and of fallibility that marks so many canonical thinkers in the philosophical tradition, at least before, say, Nietzsche. Resonances of this philosophical inflation, call it foundationalism or reification if that helps, if the language of inflation doesn't work for you. Resonances of this inflation seem to shape the way Professor Balfour frames her argument in a few places. She opens, for example, this is the question that I read in a way that did not show up here, and I'll ask her if this is why it doesn't show up that way anymore. She opens, for example, by asking whether it is possible to demand the empowerment of ordinary people without uncritically embracing the demos. The answer to this question is that of course it's possible, because possibility is in some ways a very low bar. The real question is what this critical demand looks like and how one does it and how one does it better and what happens afterwards and how you do it again after it goes off the rails. This is the lesson of Wolin's Fugitive Democracy, about which we might also disagree. It is also in a way the lesson of Saidiya Hartman and Stephen Best's Fugitive Justice. Our ideals are always provisional and transient and ephemeral. They're always on the way out. Each instantiation is always buckling under the weight of its own contradictions. But the failures just require failing again and failing better. This is a question of practice and experience, not of possibility, and not, I tried very hard not to invoke Kant here, but it's certainly not a question of conditions of possibility, which the language of possibility invites us to slide down the slippery slope to. Similarly, Professor Balfour's argument slips between reflections on particular political forms, democracy in the US at particular moments in time, and reflections on capital T, the capital P political, on democracy as such, which is, it appears, supposed to be beset by certain congenital difficulties. Maybe this is just a failure of my readerly practice, and I'm supposed to read US democracy everywhere I see democracy in the text. But I'm not sure the text of the lecture supports that reading. The right response to this worry is a call for close reading, but we can't do that here because one shouldn't do exegesis in the pulpit, so I'll just move on. In this spirit, Professor Balfour concludes by saying that Morrison declines to double down on democratic faith and focuses instead on the interior lives of throwaway people. Morrison declines to double down on democratic faith and focuses instead on the interior lives of throwaway people. But isn't this refocusing itself a democratic gesture? Dewey wrote that democracy involves a faith in the capacities of ordinary people, a faith in the people that Whitman called the common and the low. It is opposed to a reflexive deference to the lofty and the elite. So why is Morrison's version of this a refusal of democratic faith? I wonder if we mean different things by faith, and I fear we mean different things by democracy. In conclusion, I have some other questions, mostly about the theoretical assumptions that animate some of the argument. One of these questions involves the way Morrison, or Balfour's Morrison, seems to overestimate the exceptional nature of narrative and its distance from argumentation. If I were a better student of informal logic and argumentation theory, I would say a great deal now about the way in which certain arguments presuppose the work of the interlocutor in just the way we have been told narration does, but I'm not good at that stuff, so I'll just move on. Another question registers my dismay at the language of attending to everything everywhere, which strikes me as an odd oversimplification of basic perceptual and cognitive mechanisms. You can't attend to everything everywhere. And anyway, that's not what Morrison does. She attends to more things and different things than her political theory readers do. But all perception is selective, right? One picks some things to attend to while setting others aside. The hope is that one sets these things aside provisionally, and as Dewey says in some places, returns to common experience to check your results, right? I ask these questions not because I'm super keen to explore them. They don't concern me over much because they bear on arguments that Professor Balfour borrows from other people, right? The first thing about narration versus argument is from Morrison. The second thing is from Jill Frank, I think. She may not want to be committed to them and may have no stake in defending them. And in any case, she's done enough heavy lifting elsewhere in the argument to earn some grace on these inherited difficulties. I'll hasten to a close by noting that I always find Professor Balfour's work not only edifying and instructive, but inspiring. She models forms of intellectual engagement that remind me why many of us go into this very peculiar business. I'm grateful to her for doing this work, for inviting and receiving my perhaps impertinent and nitpicky questions in good humor, and for showing us what it means to live the life of the mind with integrity, imagination, and curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we will now start taking questions. Casey, was Casey going to moderate it? Or do you want to do that, Nick? Okay.
Right.
Let me just say, during the course of questions that the audience will be asking, Professor Balfour may like to also fold in some responses to Paul and Jasmine as well at the same time. So,
If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll run you the microphone so that folks online can hear, and also for the recording. All right.
So part of this might be with the last response. I'm just thinking, well, why is possibility the goal? These moments of possibility and ambiguity, I don't know if we'd call them quantum states per se, but where there is this option that's beyond what we presently are, because I really have an affinity for the argument, well, what about these democratic norms? Aren't those still driving us to think about these moments of possibility as opportunities to empower those who are disempowered or marginalized? So just if you could speak a little more to that, why is that the goal?
Okay, great, thank you. And actually that gives me a chance to say something about Paul's comments in the sense that, I think you're absolutely right that, possibility and possible, I think, are often cheat words that when you're beginning to try to figure out what your argument is, it becomes the place for what you haven't yet figured out how to define. And I think that that's part of, I mean, I think the idea that, you know, contingency is inevitable, which means that we are neither, you know, we are neither fated to fail, although chances are that you know, our loftiest aspirations will end in more like, I mean, you know, success that turns out not to be what we thought it was going to be in the first place. I mean, that's, you know, anyone who's been involved in any kind of political organization or practice knows that, like, winning sometimes is the worst thing you can do. So I think that you know, that there's a demand there to be more careful and more rigorous, and that with the language and the possibilities are is a kind of a flabby way of talking about an openness to what's unanticipated, to what's contingent, to the ways in which one may be struggling against overwhelming odds and must still continue to do so without knowing, you know, how that will turn out. I do think that one of the moves that Morrison makes in her critical writing, and this may be something that we disagree about, but she does, when she uses the language of mapping and exploring, because she's trying to envision a space where she sees writing as a practice where one can potentially have the kind of experience of discovery, of making sense out of chaos. She uses a language of sovereignty, actually, to describe that. That's not available sort of in our everyday lives. But she also knows that that's always an illusory, you know, so she can persist in this enterprise and thinks that it's absolutely important. But at the same time, the idea that you're ever going to have control over the story or over your life is illusory. I'm not sure that answers the question precisely, but that's where I think that the kind of the opportunity, and I think she sees both opportunity and necessity, and I would say she both maps and digs into the terrain. But the mapping and the opportunity language is her claiming language, especially when she's thinking about the US founding. She claims language and says, how great would it be to have this experience of exploration without the mandate for conquest? And so operating in a literary world allows her to try to do that.
We have one more question back here. Hi, thank you for the talk today. I really appreciate it. My question is about the application of what we've talked about in the reality of our world today. We're seeing everyday policymakers doing more and more to erase the stories of historically marginalized communities within legislatures across the country, and going further to even suppress their voices when it comes to their political participation, which is a historical trend which isn't new. So while we might be able to share these narrations amongst ourselves and our circles, is it possible to take power back within a system that is attempting so hard to silence these narratives? And if so, how do we take that power back, the power of narration and storytelling back, as we're experiencing this politics of censorship?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's a great question, and certainly one that hits. I mean, I'm coming from Virginia, where these issues are very much, you know, under discussion. We have defenses of free speech, which go hand in hand with the disallowance of teaching of so-called critical race theory or those stories that you're talking about. I think there are two pieces, and I'm actually really curious to hear what Jasmine and Paul have to say about this. My response would be that there are two pieces to your question. One is about the project of keeping these stories, you know, in circulation, telling and retelling them. That there are I mean, one of the things that I think has been so profoundly moving to me anyway about some contemporary organizing is the degree to which it is explicitly historical, explicitly dependent on, or not dependent on, but drawing from what went, the movements and the people that went before, but also is, you know, that, and this is where I was drawing on Jasmine's work and political scientist Diva Woodley's work. I'm thinking about being politically active is involving a whole human being and a whole community. So we're not simply sort of goal-oriented, but attending to the kind of full sort of multidimensionality of how people live. I do have one sobering response, so this is the second part. I think you're absolutely right that squelching, silencing these stories, silencing these voices is a pivotal way of shifting, you know, further disempowering communities that already don't have access to control over their own circumstances often. But as somebody who's been interested in the politics of memory for a long time, and especially in the politics of reparations, one of the things that has struck me is that we're actually living in a moment where there's so much more circulation of historical narratives, and yet the conditions have gotten worse for so many. So, and this is the puzzle I don't know how to figure out, which is at a time when Confederate statues are coming down, alternate memorializations are going up, and yet we see, you know, that in terms of political voice, economic, environmental, you know, well-being, health outcomes, and so forth, that the history that was demanded for so long by so many and is so critical is also coexisting with these, you know, deeply destructive policies. So it's a kind of a gloomy second part, but I'm hoping Jasmine or Paul could.
Oh, well, it seems like it dovetails perfectly with your response just previously, because that kind of contradiction is constitutive of opportunity, right? That something new can come into the frame that we didn't expect to be in the mainstream, but all of a sudden is, right? And so, I mean, what I'm seeing in movement spaces is that folks are very, very committed to making sure their stories will circulate, to the extent that one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, is now working in Hollywood, right? And was storyboarding like sitcoms and things like this, and using those spaces to smuggle in abolitionist paradigms, narratives, figures, histories, events, culture, in ways that, I'm not gonna lie, made me very excited, but they're all happening within an economic apparatus that's designed to gloss over the distinctions of the political that make those moves radical. And so, you know, the work that I do is so much inspired by storytellers on the ground who use storytelling as a form of political. This is actually what I used to do when I was in my 20s, is like hip hop spoken word guerrilla theater, right? Like they use their stories to tell another kind of story of the political that is performative, that's interactive, that's about a mutual reciprocity of information and education. And they're the ones who taught me that there's a way to infiltrate to educate, to be in but not of, to borrow from Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's Undercommons.
Du Bois actually said it first.
But in the context of this representation, politics of representation, I think a lot about the fact that we are trying to navigate the neoliberal enclosures of our own self-representation and regard, and that we might have to be a little bit more careful and sleuthful in how we do so. Because I don't think we quite understand how strong that undertow towards the objectification of our stories really can be. But I think there's a lot of room there.
So So I'll just say briefly that thank you for the question, in part because it provoked this gesture at this kind of paradox that you mentioned, right? There are more stories out there, and yet we're seeing these untoward outcomes. One of the things that puts me in mind of is the need to connect the essential work of storytelling to the hard, boring work of routine political mobilization, right?
That part.
I'm encouraged to think about this in part by some of the stuff that goes on in Tennessee, where I'm from. There are lots of stories out there, and they are being told by really interesting people who work in really interesting cultural nonprofits and local movement groups and that sort of thing. But it's very hard for those stories to get traction more broadly, in part because the people who run the opposition political apparatus in Tennessee until very recently just had no sense that this was a valuable thing to do, right? That the only thing for the political organization to do was to send out email blasts to get you to send money, right? Whereas many people who think hard about these things will say to you something like what Professor Balfour said. One of the hard things about the work of politics is bringing your whole self to it, right? And making it a space where people can imagine rich, full lives in opposition to the things that are happening, right? I think in these contexts about people like Dorothy Day, the great Catholic activist, right? That was her life, right? It wasn't about getting somebody to send me $5, right? And so the storytelling has to be woven into the work of politics in ways that people in opposition spaces in places like where I'm from just can't imagine, or just beginning to figure out how to imagine.
Professor Johnston, I think we are coming close to the end of our time. Did you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like folks to
Well, I'd
think
like to
about?
give Lawrie a chance if you'd like to say something in response to what Professor Taylor has said, because I noticed you taking notes.
Yes.
So it could be for future use, but if you would like to engage anything in particular that either of them said, please feel free.
I do have notes, and they were actually precisely the kinds of comments I was hoping to. I mean, that I'm just deeply grateful. I think maybe it's best to think about them further rather than hold people up today. Thanks.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our three professors here for
Very nicely done. I didn't say this up there. I love the piece. I love it.
Well, no, I mean, I feel like